Hello, we're going to be talking about, I started to say crisis management. I have that more in my mind, but conflict management. This is going to be a bit involved, and this is part one, and we will continue through part three on this. There's a lot here to talk about. This, of course, is based on the textbook Public Relations Strategies and Tactics by Wilcox and Cameron, the 10th edition. This is as it has been throughout the semester. I hope you do have that textbook and that you're reading along, and you can get a used version of it. Strategic conflict management is what we're talking about here. Conflict is the key word. Conflict, of course, takes many forms. As your textbook notes, this can range from warfare to teenage spats, so it can be very, very serious indeed, down to things that are fairly minor. Conflict involves attacks and confrontations between organizations and stakeholders. For example, the Sierra Club might lobby Home Depot to stop advertising on Fox News if one of the hosts on Fox News was downplaying the importance or the significance of climate change, for example, and then Home Depot would be in the middle there between the two, and Home Depot would be dealing with conflict. Walmart may adopt environmental policies that many would support and would praise Walmart for doing, but that may put it in conflict with shrimpers in Thailand who have not accepted these new environmental practices, and these practices will cause problems for the shrimpers in Thailand. And now Walmart and the Thailand shrimpers are in conflict. So those are some examples of what conflict might be. PR professionals develop strategies and processes to influence the course of conflicts to the benefit of the organization and, when possible, to the benefit of the organization's many constituents. The reality is you can't make everyone happy. There are some situations where there is just going to be conflict, and we cannot resolve a situation to everyone's pleasure, to everyone's satisfaction, and some people will remain unhappy. So that is just, unfortunately, a reality sometimes. So we want to resolve the conflict, first of all, to the benefit of the organization we represent, if possible, to the benefit of the many constituents of the organization as well. But again, they themselves may not always be in agreement. Conflict management is a more muscular form of public relations than what we have talked about up to now. Think of an athlete who competes against other athletes but maintains a sense of fair play and cordiality. The Olympic athlete Lindsey Vonn was given as an example in the textbook. Here's a video on conflict management. Now, this is not strictly related to public relations per se, but it still relates to the subject that we're talking about.
It's hard to manage your workload, especially when your team doesn't know who's working on what. But with Monday.com,
Before we start understanding conflict and learning how to handle it effectively, we need to define terms. So let's have a look at what the terms conflict and conflict management really mean. Conflict is when two or more people assert their rights over property, assets, resources, decisions, even ideas, in such a way that they restrict the rights of others. It's worth noting that two people can contend their rights through negotiation as well. Negotiation is really nothing more nor less than conflict conducted in a civil way. It's done so respectfully, and it's done so following a process. Now, we won't be covering negotiation in this program, but it's worth noting that to a degree, our aim in managing conflict is to transform conflict into a negotiation. Now, conflict doesn't have to be bad. It can be good. It can lead to challenge and learning and conversation and growth. It can lead to creativity and new ideas. But conflict can be bad. It can be stressful. It can damage relationships, and it can impact adversely on productivity and effectiveness.
So we'll stop that at that point and continue on with our discussion of conflict. Professional practice in conflict management requires a sense of mission and conviction that your organization's behavior is honorable and defensible. We have talked about before, it's important that you go to work for an organization that you respect and that supports your point of view or whose values you share. So it's important to know about an organization before you go to work for that organization. Ideally, you will work for an organization that whose behavior you believe is honorable and defensible in general. That you must also believe, ideally, that the organization is ethical, that your organization's mission is worthy. So again, it's important to, if at all possible, and it's perhaps not always possible, but if at all possible, to only accept work for an organization that you admire. Also important that the advocacy of the organization has integrity, that the way you go about your public relations activities, that there is integrity there, that the organization works at creating mutual benefits whenever possible. And again, it is not always possible. Sometimes there are things that just cannot be resolved, differences, philosophical differences that cannot be resolved. But whenever possible, creating mutual benefits. There's something called it depends, and this is sort of stating the obvious, but it depends, a system for managing conflict, and this determines the stance the organization will take toward each public or stakeholder involved in the conflict. So flexibility is part of this. Two basic principles of it depends. Many factors determine the stance or position of an organization when it comes to dealing with conflict. So this is going to be somewhat complicated. It is not easy to predict what in any particular situation what factors all may bear on the situation. So many factors will determine the stance or position, and then the PR stance will be dynamic and will change as events unfold. So what we're talking about here basically is flexibility, and also that every situation is going to be different. The contingency continuum in conflict management ranges from pure advocacy to pure accommodation, and we have an illustration of it. This is not exactly the illustration that is in your textbook. It's a little bit more complex than the one that's in the textbook, but everything that's in the textbook is here. And on the left there, you have pure advocacy, which is you are arguing your position. You are basically, it's not necessarily a defensive position, but probably a defensive position. You are taking your own point of view and you are advocating strongly as possible for that point of view. And then pure accommodation is basically acknowledging that the other side was right. So you have competing on one end. I would think that litigation PR, where you go to court in a case, might even be beyond simply competing. But that's on the advocacy end, and then on the accommodation end, you have apology and restitution. So it can range from one extreme to the other. There in the middle, you see compromising, avoiding, cooperation, negotiation, things like that, which may be more typical in general. A matrix of contingency factors. Dozens of factors influence the PR stance in a conflict. We were talking about this a couple of minutes ago when we talked about the "it depends" approach. Well, it depends is, that's saying a lot. So the dozens of factors may be external threats outside of the organization, things that could cause harm to the organization that perhaps we don't have control over or limited control over. The industry-specific environment, the general political and social environment, and how our actions are going to be perceived within the political and social realm. The external public's characteristics. Who are the people that we are dealing with, either people who are our own constituents and the people that we serve, and then others who may not be sympathetic to our organization. Internal factors. We don't always agree internally. People within the organization may disagree. Internal threats would be similar to that. The general corporate or organizational characteristics, in particular management, what are their philosophies and styles? Again, all of these things are going to come into play. They will be part of the contingency factors that will determine how we're going to respond. Top management characteristics, that would be, that I would think, another aspect of corporate and organizational characteristics. Personality characteristics of internal and involved persons. The people that we're working with, and what are they like? You can imagine how this can affect decisions. And then relationship characteristics, I think, is almost another way of saying the same thing. So all of these factors will come into play in that it depends approach, and then on that contingency continuum that we were talking about. All of these factors will determine where we fall on that continuum. So this is part one, end of part one, and we will continue with part two next time. Thanks.